Welcome to another episode of Top Lines and Tales, where we continue this week with our history of native livestock breeds. We'd like to thank our sponsors, who are, as always, Harbro, who are manufacturers and suppliers of quality livestock nutrition. The Southdown sheep is the oldest of the terminal sire breeds in UK, and as the name suggests, originates from the native sheep which have roamed the South Downs in the south of England for many hundreds of years, developed by foresighted flockmasters into a fixed type in the 18th century. And it's probably said that between the Southdown and the Leicester, that they between them have been responsible for pretty much most of the other breeds in the UK, or certainly in England, in one way or other. And, for example, breeds like the Suffolk, the Hampshire, the Dorset and the Shropshire all own their origins to the Southdown breed. This week we're speaking with agricultural journalist and top Southdown breeder, and indeed current chairman of the society, Jonathan Long. Welcome to the podcast, John.
Thank you, Andy.
And it's pretty fair, really, to say that most of the sheep with the word down in the title did come from the Southdown, didn't they?
They would at some point have had Southdown origins, and obviously that's going back probably more than 200 years for many of them. But yes, they'd all originated from a Southdown somewhere along the way.
And the Suffolk we've recently mentioned on this podcast was formed by a Southdown ram on a Norfolk ewe. I think it's that way round.
It is that way around, yeah. It's a common mistake. People think it's the other way around, but it was actually the Southdown ram which was used as the improver in that instance.
And there is the Hampshire, which was a Wiltshire horn sire on a Southdown ewe, would I be right?
No, it's actually again the Southdown ram on Wiltshire horn and Berkshire not used. It's almost a three-way cross there.
Okay.
So there probably would have been some Southdown females in the mix, but the main influence in the Southdown again being the improver there on the native ewes of that part of the world.
Sure. And likewise, I suppose, with the Dorset further across there again was another Southdown cross, and the Oxford as well. Or I think the Oxford had some hamp in it, didn't it? Not quite sure. It gets a bit confusing.
It does. The Oxford, as I understand it, and it is confusing, was Hamp and Southdown ewes crossed with a Cotswold ram.
Right, okay.
But again, we're going back 200 years, and who's to know what was actually done and what wasn't and was written down. So it's always a slight mishmash of breeds.
And the Dorset, again, as I said, owes its heritage to them too. And also other breeds such as the Cheviot, which has certainly been enhanced by the use of the Southdown over the years, as it possibly the Ryland. And I liken the Southdown a little bit to the Shorthorn cattle breed, a breed that was widely used as an improver on the native breeds of various areas.
That's right, and it's been used, in fact, the world over as an improver, and certainly across the UK, England, as you say, definitely. Many parts of England have benefited from the Southdown ram onto their native or local females to put a bit of shape and a bit of stature into them, and then being fixed into a type and moved into becoming their own breeds in their own right.
And today, the breed can be found, you said, worldwide, found in the UK, obviously, France, Australia, New Zealand, America, and many other countries around the globe, where its ability to produce high-quality lamb has led it to be recognised probably as the king among the terminal sires across the world.
Certainly, and it's said the sun never sets on the Southdown. It's very true. Australia and New Zealand, it's having a resurgence in those two countries. America has gone in slightly different, with many of their sheep breeds, slightly different tracks, shall we say. And there have historically also been Southdowns in Russia and South America. I think in 1795, Southdown rams were sent to Russia by John Elman out to the eminent authorities over there. And there were more recent exports in the early part or middle part of the last century to Russia as well.
Okay, we'll have a look at some of those exports in a minute. Let's just go back to the origins of the breed. And the Breed Society was officially formed in 1891 with Edwin Ellis as president. But as with quite a few other breeds we've spoken about on this series, the breed predates that considerably. And there's rumour, is there any evidence to say that the breed actually existed on those chalk downs back over a millennium ago when William the Conqueror first set foot in England back in 1066?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say there would have been sheep on the downs at that point. Whether they are direct relations to what we've got now as the Southdown is, of course, up for debate. But I think, the modern Southdown was fixed as a type from the native sheep on those Southdown areas. John Elman back in the 1700s. And he really was sort of the forefather of the breed in fixing the type and moved on from there.
We'll just have a quick word about John Elman in a second, but tell our listener a bit more about the Southdowns themselves. You're from that area, John. Give us a quick geography lesson here as to where exactly are they? Let's start there.
Well, the Southdowns are a chalk downland which sort of run from Lewes in the east across to near enough Portsmouth in the west. and there are chalk downland, thin soils on top of chalk, growing fairly sparse grass, sward on most areas, and in fact a lot of it's now arable. But again, it's a thin downland soil there across a chalky base, which was farmed for as long back as most people can remember, and way beyond that. And particularly in the latter century, was heavily stocked with sheep, in a rotation with arable and progressing, in that golden hoof improving the ground type scenario.
Would that be sea facing some of that land? Are you right down there on the coast or inland a little bit?
Yeah, a lot of it would be on the coast. My grandfather's old farm down there at Shore and by Sea, which tells you how close to the sea it was.
Yeah.
A lot of it would run along the coastal range there. None of it would be more than, I'd say, 20 miles from the coast.
And there'd be a lot of that would be common land going back the way, and is that still the case? Is there still common land about there, or is it just all privately owned?
No, not to my knowledge, there wouldn't be any common ground down there. It would all be enclosed and farmed under some form of tenure.
And you mentioned the master of the breed could be determined as John Elman of Glynde, and born in 1753. It's a long time back, and thankfully the famous agriculturalist Arthur Young, who crops up on this programme time after time, wrote a fair account of Elman's life, most of which revolved around sheep, I have to say, and he firstly praises the merits of the breed and on how densely they could be stocked with numbers of over 2 per acre, and over 2 per acre would be a fairly dense stock. Would that again be on the downs at 2 per acre?
That would be on the downs, yeah, and on that, back in that time, those thin chalk downs, there wouldn't have been a lot of extra nutrition put into that ground, so any, grass would have grown from whatever was there, basically, and whatever manure the sheep left behind. 2 an acre doesn't sound a lot in modern day terms, but yeah, back then it would have been a fairly decent stocking, I imagine.
And there'd be a slightly smaller sheep than we talked about the Leicester last week, and there'd be slightly smaller sheep than the Leicester, so maybe there would be a little bit more per acre, but they wouldn't be tiny, would they? The Southdowns back then, they'd still be strong beasts, wouldn't they?
No, they'd be a very strong sheep in their day. I think there's a lot of confusion among many people about the size of a Southdown and where it rates, and I think if you go back to the time of John Elman, they would have been a decent sized sheep, competing not necessarily with the Leicester on size, but certainly not far behind it, I would imagine.
Mm-hmm. And then society sales eventually followed in subsequent years after the society was formed, and the main one would be in Chichester, which is sort of down on that Downs area, isn't it? And again, as with a few of these early flocks, I suppose the females weren't required to have a full pedigree, leaving the door open a little bit to unsupervised improvement, should we say. But that's not to say that most ewes weren't pure. I think they would be, and just that some of the paperwork just wasn't there with them. But the sires had to be pure, though, didn't they, to be registered with the society right back then?
They did, yeah. I mean, I think a lot of these early flocks would have been 3, 4, 5, 600 in number, and registering that number of females every year, lambs number of females every year would have been a thankless task, and so it was sort of taken as trust that the females were purebred, and a lot of flocks would have had their own records as to what was what, shall we say. But the other rams would have been pure and registered and full pedigree.
Okay. I mean, there would have been people obviously trying to improve. Everybody's trying to improve all the time, aren't they? But again, not uncommon with a society, a second Southdown society was formed, and then a bit of squabbling between who owned what, until eventually they all agreed to one aim, and then they joined forces round about the turn of the century, I think.
Yeah, that's right. In 1891, you got the Southdown Sheep Association forms, and in 1893, the Southdown Sheep Club forms, and then 1897, the two sort of come together, recognising they're both after the same thing and they have the same aims, and they managed to find a format they were both happy with and joined forces under the banner of the Southdown Sheep Society as we know it today.
Didn't take them as long as maybe some of the other breeds, Hereford breeds, for instance.
No, it certainly didn't.
But the breed was popular choice with cattle grazers as well, and I imagine they would run well alongside side cattle going back the way. And I've got records of Hugh Watson, of course, is the founder of the Aberdeen Angus, right up there in Angus, and he had a flock of prize-winning Southdowns. So he was a smart guy doing his improving as well. So he'd be having a go at improving them in one direction or other, I guess.
He would. I mean, Hugh Watson's flock, as I understand it, was formed in 1814. Which is way back before even the society existed, and he did develop a hell of a strong flock up there. And I did see a catalogue actually for his dispersal at one point a few years ago, and that was, I think, he was about 1,000 head then. So yeah, and I guess his flock would have been formed off the likes of John Elman's type of sheep and Jonas Webb sheep from Babraham up in Cambridgeshire there. So he'd have had a good flock, I'm sure.
Yeah. It has to be said that a flock of Southbounds was fashionable for a while to have, but certainly in England and probably abroad as well, but within wealthy circles, and a bit like the Shorthorn cattle and later the Angus cattle, anybody had heard of those things. And we had the likes of the Duke of Richmond involved, of course, at the famous Goodwood estate. And I think Goodwood's still got Southdowns now. It must be a busy old place with motorsport and horse racing and farm shops and restaurants and everything else, but still advocates of the Southdown to this day, I think, John.
They are. I mean, actually, the current Goodwood flock was actually founded in 2002.
Okay.
They did disperse back in the 50s or 60s somewhere there, and then they've restarted. But again, that original Goodwood flock dates back to at least 1778.
Right.
That's the first mention of Southdowns being a Goodwood. But yeah, so the modern flock is a relatively recent incarnation following a previous dispersal. But they the shepherd down Nick Page has done a hell of a job and developed a very good flock, and very much at the fore of the breed in this modern era.
Certainly seem to win their fair share of shows. I see their name bandied about it. And along with that, I suppose, to cement the theory that I've come up with there, that the sheep were upheld in high societies, we had Captain John Christie's Ringmer flock at Glyndebourne Estate, which were eventually replaced, of course, with the Grand Opera House, which still stands today and entertaining the very same types of the hoi polloi. And would that be the same Glynd that we're looking at that Elman had those couple of hundred years earlier?
Yeah, exactly the same place. I think Elman was a tenant of the Glynd estate there, so it would have been on very similar ground. And you talk about the hoi polloi, and if you want to go into the real upper echelons, you've got the royal flocks as well. And there's a flock at Sandringham, founded in 1866 by King Edward VII, okay, and then carried on by his descendants up until certainly the early 1900s, not later.
And Sandringham being in Norfolk, is it not? So I suppose that's
it is indeed, yeah.
You'd probably be at that crossing those, breeding those Suffolks as well, maybe. And before we move on to a few of the more recent flocks, let's just take a look at some of those exports that we talked about earlier and the overseas influence that they had. And starting looking closely at France, a country that since provided the UK with many of its modern sheep breeds, and the Southdown was exported there back in 1826, 200 years ago, give or take. And the French are loath to admit that they actually even have crossbreds of anything, or most of the breeds. I mean, I live in France, most of the breeds here are kept pure of one sort or another. But nearly all of the early maturing breeds that France have produced back into the UK, such as the Vendine and the Berichon and the Ile-de-France, they've all come from Southdown backgrounds, and probably be true of the Charollais breed as well, Jonathan.
Yeah, I mean, the Charollais is probably the most noted of the Southdown descendants in France, and it's debatable as to what the other half of the Charollais is. I personally suspect it's a Rouge, maybe, with the Southdown on it, that's related to the modern Charollais. But certainly, there is history of a Southdown being used in France to create the Charollais and, as you say, other breeds as well. And they've then developed themselves into purebreds, and much as the same has happened over here with the Hampshire and the Oxfords we already talked about.
I think our listener probably starting to realise now why this podcast on the Southdowns is quite so significant. If we go back the way for all, it may be in its true form probably is not one of the most big numbers of sheep in the UK. There is a lot of history just about in all these breeds worldwide. And the French did keep, I think, in the main, a large register of pure Southdowns as well, though I saw somewhere up to 300,000 after the war, so probably more than the UK, I guess, in pure. And some of these found their way back into the UK in the 70s. And then more recently, Jonathan, you ventured over the water to our side and brought a few decent sires back yourself.
Yeah, we have. We've been out in France buying sheep since 2005 now. We've had 8 or 9 tups and a few females out of there over the last 15, 16 years from 3 different flocks. And in fact, we followed the lead set by the late Sheila Coleman. She bought a sheep called Thomasine in 1991, which really sort of, should we say, stirred the pot and moved things on a wee bit. He was a tremendous sheep. She'd found him at Osceola for a show and had bought him privately and brought him back across the water along with a couple of females herself, and really did sort of kick-start things, a bit of a revival of the breed in the 90s. And then the late Sir Richard Cooper was out. He bought a sheep in 2004 out of France. I say we followed on just a year later than that, and really have sort of got stuck into that sort of just pool of genetics, although it's not a big one anymore. Like you say, there was big flocks over there in the sort of the wartime, but now I think there's maybe 7 flocks in the whole of France now.
I remember Richard going over there, Sir Richard Cooper going over there as a friend of mine, and saying the depth of carcass that they had in the sheep there was just what we were looking for over here. So I mean that tends to be the case with a lot of the other breeds in France. They do they do breed for a lot more muscle, don't they?
They do, and they took the breed and focused on particular attributes of it, and as you go around the world, you'll find the same breed looking very different wherever you go, and that's what the French did. They took the breed and made it suit their market, and if you look at what's happened with the breeds coming in from the continent, they've obviously had a type of sheep that's more suited to the modern market, and therefore we've gone back out there to bring some of those genetics back in.
Of course we have, yeah, in just about all our breeds now, certainly. If we move around the world, I mean, for those who have had little association with the Southdown breed, New Zealand is probably one of the largest sheep-producing nations per capita than anywhere else in the world, and it based most of its early lamb production on the Southdown and the Romney breed, and still is today. That influence can still be seen today in New Zealand, and again, these date back to 1850s. One of the main breeders was a chap called Henry Andrew of the Punchbowl flock, who dispersed in the late 1970s. But the breed, as with France, fell from its popularity of 1,700 flocks in 1960 to just 17 in 1990. But did some of those purebred strains from New Zealand find their way back into UK as well? I know they have done with the Ryland breed. Some come back.
Yeah, they have, and there's plenty of documented history, and the Southdown Society actually imported 3 or 4 rams from New Zealand to share among the breeders as a way of widening the G pool in the 70s, and then Philip and Rose from Whitcomb of the Green Cross flock brought in pure strains, females and males, and basically developed a pure New Zealand flock here in the UK, and bred a different type of Southdown in many ways to what was over here, a longer, larger, leaner type. And those genetics are still floating about in various places. They actually dispersed the initial flock in 1996, that would have been, and then refounded in partnership with the Baker family, actually from Australia, what became the Southern Cross flock, which then dispersed again in 2015, somewhere there. So again, we're 6 years down the line, there's still some of those genetics available, and we've actually got semen in the tank off one Southern Cross tup that we use here and there just to put a bit of extra different blood in now and again.
So, certainly in the Rylands, I know that Richard Weir brought some Australian and New Zealand blood in there to lift the animals up, and they are a different type of sheep, but sometimes you do need that different genetics, but they didn't lift them like the Americans did, and we talk about the Americans on this program quite a lot, and the popularity in America have always been strong, of course, particularly at their fat stock shows, such as Chicago Exhibition, and winning most of the spoils going back the way there. But like most things in the States, they've kind of crossed and messed about with the pedigrees, and they don't really like pedigrees anyway. In America, they tend to turn everything into hybrids, and now we see Southdowns are nearly 4 foot tall with legs like pine trees, John, and quite bizarre, isn't it?
They're certainly different. Although you have to admire, and I follow quite a few Southdown flocks out there through the wonder of social media these days, and what have you, and the growth that they've managed to achieve in a lot of their sheep is quite outstanding, I have to say, and it's something that it intrigues me. I'll put it that way, as to how they've achieved such phenomenal growth rate in a breed like the Southdown, which isn't a slow growing breed in the first place, but the size they can get them to in the time span they can is certainly intriguing.
Uh-huh. Certainly, they're big on doing their tests, and they're also, as I said, they're not precious about their pedigrees and not frightened to bring something in that they think is going to be an improver. And I think that's probably very much a sign of how breeding goes on in the USA in general, in many other breeds.
Well,
And moving close to home, I'm right in saying your Charollais flock would be one of the oldest in the country, John. When did you get started? And where?
Our flock is the Charollais Brook flock. My grandfather's flock was a Charollais flock, which he founded in 1954, having come back from war service and got a tenancy down there at Charollais, just outside Lewis. And then he moved then down to Shoreham by Sea a few years after that and expanded the flock and worked away. And then my parents started a flock for me, which was the Brook flock in 1988. Uh-huh. And then on my grandfather's passing in 91, we merged the 2 flocks together, and created the Charollais Brook flock. So we are, to the best of our knowledge, and no one's challenged us yet, the oldest continuous flock or continuous breeding in the country. Okay. And we've really worked away from there and tried to develop the breed and develop the flock into something that suits the modern market. And
we talk about the modern market. I mean, the modern market for you, of course, is you did move north into Herefordshire and stuck yourself right in the middle of the Ryland country there, and that's I'm not quite sure how the two of those breeds compare. I mean, I'm a bit of a Ryland fan myself. I'm not sure how those two of those breeds compare, but is the Southdown suited to the area where you are now there in Herefordshire?
It's certainly not failing, I'll put it that way, Andy. No, and we're lucky. We've got a good farm here with some good ground, and the breed and the sheep are absolutely thriving here.
Mm-hmm.
And I think being a down breed, that's at the Ryland, they thrive pretty much anywhere they go.
Yeah. If we talk about a few of those other early flocks, there would be the Bryn Glas flock in Wales, the Moulton flock, I think were they Cambridgeshire, and David Randall's Camber Castle flock.
But yeah, no, I mean, the Bryn Glas flock in Wales was the late George Hughes, who was so influential in the NFA Rams over built there, and then the Moulton flock is Hugh Clark. And, both those flocks would have been very much up there in their day. Hugh Clark's flock dispersed in, 97, 98, somewhere there. And those genetics still spread far and wide. And you can still trace them back fairly, not too many generations back in a lot of flocks today.
Another flock that probably more recently would be, I think, the Wakeham Dorset flock goes back a while, but then merged with Harmer as well, and the Wakeham Dorset Harmer. And where are they based? They certainly seem to be up there.
They're the Ridings flock, and they're based down in just outside Lewes, down on the South Downs there. A very prominent flock in recent years, without a doubt. And again, another flock that's been fairly staunch in their imports from France in recent years, and bringing in new genetics to try and move the breed forward and move their flock forward in much the same way we have. But no, they'd be in amongst the top in recent years.
Okay, and most of these flocks, of course, we're talking are based in the south. You'd be one of the more northern ones, but with yourself moving north. But there were a few in Scotland. We mentioned Hugh Watson originally, but the Fairley flock owned by Cyril Wise, who we know from other breeds as well, in around Dumfriesshire. There are there quite a few flocks up north now, in above the border, should I say?
There's a few up in Scotland. It sort of ebbs and flows around 4 and 5, basically, up in Scotland. Not many, but there's a few, and there's another couple of guys started in the last couple of years up there. And it's like all these things. There's a place for them, and they're a good breed. And I mean, we sell quite a lot of rams in Scotland over the last 10 years. Okay. To various commercial guys up there to go and use on new lambs. So there's a place for them, without a doubt.
Okay, we'll go on to the merits of their modern day role in a second. And let's just talk about the Rare Breed Survival Trust. And it's something, again, that few of the breeds we've talked about on these recent podcasts of history did an incredible job in preserving a lot of these things. Joe Henson, forward-thinking man, and the crowd of people around him. And the Southdown would have benefited very much from the RBST. In its survival.
Yes, without a doubt, the RBST and the interest that being involved with the RBST brings to breeds is always beneficial, and we're very thankful that the breed's now moved off the watch list of the RBST and is standing its own ground, but certainly there for a few years, and the late 80s, early 90s, through the 90s, and the involvement with the RBST and the influence that brings to bear on people that see the breed or take to breeding the sheep has certainly helped us get back to where we are now.
Incredible of those guys to see and to understand that a lot of these breeds were going to be lost if they didn't do something about it. And as you said, through the 80s and the 90s, they did dramatic work in preserving a lot of breeds that everybody owes them a term of gratitude. And of course, now as we all come off the list, maybe they're not quite as well supported as they were, because they're victims of their own success, maybe, to a point.
Yeah, but I think, obviously there's always, other breeds that will always need help along the way at some point, wherever they are and whatever type they are.
And we normally have a chat on this podcast about sort of influential rams within the breed, particularly in the last few decades or so. There are a few sires that stand out that have put their stamp in the breed and still sought after?
Yeah, there are a few. If you go back through, and I'll make no apologies for most of them actually being the imports that have come in the last 30 years. And the first one is that Thomas sheep that the late Sheila Coleman brought in 91. His progeny would have gone far and wide, and I think there wouldn't have been certainly a leading flock in the country that wouldn't have had a son or a grandson of Thomas at some point, or some influence come down from him. Mm-hmm. He just was so revolutionary in what he produced and the type of sheep that came from that flock at that time that everybody wanted a piece of it.
Were they needing that at the time? Were they mainly losing a bit of size and him needing to pick the size back up?
I think we were losing the size, but they weren't as big as they are now in some cases. And the main thing I think he brought was a bit more leanness to the breed, which, as you'll appreciate, is what the modern market is needing. And that ability to get a lamb, to sort of 40 kilos live weight without it being too fat, rather than the 32 to 34 kilo bracket that perhaps we would have been in before. Mm-hmm. Was perhaps where it really had the influence on that deeper, wider loin, which again really followed through. And yeah, that Thomas sheep would have been the one at the time that came and did the job. And some of those New Zealand imports would have done a similar thing, but perhaps not in quite the same fashion. Mm-hmm. They'd put a bit of size and a bit of length in, but perhaps not the loin and the depth of muscle that the French sheep brought. And you move on from Thomas, and then you get to a sheep I brought in 2005, which was what we nicknamed the Frog, for obvious reasons. His proper number's TC4028, and he was again certainly a game changer for us as a flock and for the breed and his progeny. There's an analysis done maybe 5 years ago now of the genetics within the Southdowns, and it was quite enlightening and almost scary to see how far his genetics had spread in a relatively short time of 10 years perhaps in a short period of time. He'd gone far and wide, and again through sons, grandsons, granddaughters, all the way across, and great grand progeny as well.
Excellent.
And then some of the New Zealand type sheep, the more recent imports of the Clifton Downs sheep in 2008, 2009, and the Charollais sheep in the same period, which were used in a few flocks, and again progeny from those have gone far and wide, and then we talked earlier about the Ridings flock, and they brought in a sheep which they called Benoit, which came from a flock in the south of France, down the Pyrenees, neck of the woods there. He's produced some tremendous sheep for them, and left sons and grandsons again that have been used far and wide. And then probably the more recent sheep, which we have note, would be a sheep again I brought in back in 2016, a sheep we called Percheron. And people sort of ask why, and you say, well, look at him, he's a Gartles. It's as simple as that. He's a big, powerful sheep. Probably the biggest Southdown type I've ever seen and had the fortune to work with. We showed him when he was a fourth year in 2018. He tipped the scales 130 kilos plus.
Wow.
Which for Southdown was just fair going.
Yeah.
So he's really just again moved things along. And his sons have gone far and wide, and grandsons as well.
Good. So he's the modern day boy. So we are, as we do with all breeds, at the end of the day, it's weight that sells, isn't it? And we are always looking for that slightly bigger sheep.
It is bigger, longer loins, deeper muscles, and all those extra bits that play the part in getting a commercial sheep into the marketplace it needs to be in.
Yeah. And you talk about the commercial sheep, and of course, you are looking to breed a commercial animal, but it would be safe to say that a lot of your breeders probably would still be hobby farmers, maybe folks with half a dozen ewes in a paddock, and the youngsters keen to get out there in the show ring, and a few folks wanting the wool. And is that still the case? Are there? I know yourselves are probably looking at it at a more commercial exercise, but a lot of people wouldn't. It would be still a hobby to them, would it?
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, the majority of the society's membership is made up of smallholders or smaller farmers that have got maybe 10 or 15 ewes and work away with them and do their thing and show locally and just enjoy having sheep about the place. And the Southdown breed is ideal for that, and it's a fairly easily handled, docile breed, and it does suit the youngsters without a doubt.
Mm-hmm. What sort of numbers are we, flocks and sheep in the UK now?
Well, about 320 active members within the society. Not all those are flock-owning members, so you're probably about 250, 260 active flocks.
Okay.
And numbers of sheep-wise, it's always a job to tell, to be fair, because we don't do an annual survey of numbers, so you'd have to take a stab in the dark at that, but it's certainly a decent number, I'll put it that way.
Yeah, well, if there's 250 active flocks, then there's certainly going to be a decent number of sheep, and you can see that by the turnouts at the shows, and as you said, the youngsters like to get involved, and again, a bit the same as the Ryland. I think the sort of similar sheep where they do have big numbers at the show because everybody likes to turn out. And talking of the Rylands, do you guys get a coloured gene in the Southdowns like they do in the Rylands? I mean, the Rylands almost split into two flocks where they've got a coloured Ryland as well as the white Ryland. Is the same?
Yeah, it is out there. It's something which historically has not been necessarily favoured. Much as like in the Rylands, historically they've always been a whiter breed. There are a few folk nowadays that are keen on them, and good luck to them in doing so. It's never been anything that's been pushed hard because generally speaking, they've not been quite the same stamp of a sheep that a white Southdowns been, but they're out there, yeah, without a doubt.
Okay, and just something to look at. If you get a dark one, then you can't register it, I guess. Which is.
No, you can. We register anything that's got a full pedigree gets registered.
Okay,
it's as simple as that. If it's got registered parents, it's registerable.
The Southdown, of course, has always been represented itself as a carcass breed, and that's starting to show in some of the fat stock shows again, including for yourself. We had a fantastic interbreed medal at this year's, or last year, should I say, the Welsh Winter Fair. For you, a cracking pair of lambs there, Jonathan. Congratulations to the pair of you.
Thank you. Yeah, no, we work away at the fat stock. I haven't done any for a few years, but we would have been showing Southdowns at fat stock shows since, well, grandfather would have started back in the 50s. Certainly I would have carried that on in the 90s and the 2000s, and we just took a few years away, in fact 8 years away from the fat stock show circuit, and came back this year, and dare I say, came back with a bit of a bang, which was a very nice surprise. Fitting in well, and we got some lambs to do the job with, so we had to go, and we picked up the native championship at the English Winter Fair, the Welsh Winter Fair, and the way down in Devon at the AgriFest Southwest as well.
Wow.
And then, really. Yeah, and remarkably, Andy, as you'll appreciate, it was the same pair of lambs at all three shows, which I've never done before, and I never thought I'd managed to achieve. I wouldn't normally do that, but it just fitted. We managed to hold them light and cheeky right all the way through, and yeah,
it's an incredible achievement. And guys, people who are listening to this podcast do show fat lambs will understand that it takes so much out of the animals when you take them to one show that and having to keep them both in pairs as well. That normally one goes the one direction and the other one the other, and you normally get, if you're doing 3 shows, you'd have 6 or 8 lambs to pull from. So 2 lambs to win. Well, quite a bit of silverware, I guess you've got on your sideboard from all that as well. So good effort.
Yeah, no, we did. I mean, it was remarkable. We never planned it. I had got that 6 or 8 lambs in the shed to do the job with, and I thought, and I actually said when we left Stafford, I said to the guys, I said, you won't see these lambs next week at Bill. I said they'll be hung up by then. And actually, I got them home and changed my mind, and we thought we'd roll them through, and we did. So yeah, it's just luck of the draw. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
Sure. And there is an annual flock competition amongst the breed that's been going, I think, for a long, long time now. I think we'd be back into the 1930s. There's a national cup that's been going there. Judged last year, I see, by the very capable Anthony Glaves, and I didn't know that the Glaves had Southdowns, but that's a big accolade to win that one, Jonathan, is it?
It is, yeah, and it's actually not been run for the last 2 years due to the actually COVID situation, but we are hopeful of getting it going again this year and getting some good entries. We were planning to run it last year as a society, but just the way that the COVID situation developed last autumn just meant that we weren't quite so keen on sending people far and wide. You mentioned the Glaze family there, and they've had a flock since the early 2000s.
Okay.
Again, as butchers.
They're very much here as butchers. They would understand the carcass side of it, and I imagine we'll probably see them out to Anthony. He doesn't mind getting his hands down on his knees for the fat stock shows as well, so I'm sure they'll be turning out with us. The prices obviously keep creeping up. The prices within the breed there. What's the record price of the breed now? Is there encouraging numbers for people to get in there and try and make some money at this?
Yeah, I mean, the breed record for a male currently stands at 3,000, which has been achieved twice, and then females were at 2.5. And I think certainly the 2 sales in this last 12 months of the 2 breed sizes have really just pushed the job on a wee bit. And the first time, this time at Worcester, which is the premier sale, we had certainly more than 1 sheep at 4 figures. But yeah, prices are creeping up, and I think that's testament to the quality that's in the breed now, and people really trying to push the job forward and move on, and new guys coming in that are willing to spend a bit of cash to get started. And it's like everything, you only start once, and so if you want to start properly, you pay a bit of money and buy the right sheep. Absolute
wise words, Jonathan. A lot of people do go into breeds for the wrong reasons, or maybe there isn't a wrong reason, I don't know. But if you're going to go into anything breeding, then buy the best you can afford when you get started. It's not about quantity, it's about quality of a few to get you going. So a good sheep is never dear, John.
Good sheep is never dear, Andy. They just get cheaper as they get better.
And like myself, of course, you're a writer and a busy man. And of course, your wife, Chrissy, runs a very successful media company, and more recently a clothing range as well, which looks to be doing well. And you must be a very busy household there in Herefordshire.
There are days, particularly through the summer months, where we don't often see each other, I'll put it that way. But no, Chris is very busy with her photography and her media work, and it's a business which has picked up, grown in the 4 years it's been going, from a standing start to something that really is quite out there now. And yeah, between her and I, we try and keep most wheels on the wagon all the time if we can.
And your daughter involved in the showing now, I guess. I imagine she'll be quite keen.
Young Sophie's very keen. She has her own flock of Southdowns and a flock of Blue Texels, and it's quite telling that after the first batch of ewes of lambs, the best top lamb in the shed is not one of mine.
Competition already.
Yeah, competition within the family already.
So, and the blue Texel is an interesting thing. A blue Texel being a black Texel. What's your take on those? Obviously, there's a few people having a dabble, and there's a lot of money involved in those things just now. Are they here to stay?
I think without a doubt they're here to stay. It'll be interesting to see how the breed develops over the next 10 to 15 years. And you'll know yourself through your involvement in the continental breeds over the past 30 years or so, there's some breeds which make a mark and stay, and there's some which make a mark and peter away and revive and then peter away again. And I think the blues will ebb and flow like every breed does. But they're certainly a useful breed, and we find them very good here on our ground and use them on the crossing flock. And Yeah, they do a job without a doubt.
Great. Well, Jonathan, I think we've had a good go at covering the Southdown breed. Thank you.
It's just nice to get some recognition for the breed, and hopefully, the breed can continue to thrive in the way it has done in the last 30, 40 years, and the next generation can take it on and move it on again.
And Jonathan, yourself have been involved in the society for a while?
Yeah, I'm currently chairman of council. I'm very keen to keep moving the breed forward and bring in a new generation of breeders to really help us push forward and secure the future of the breed.
Well, for all some of our listeners might just have dismissed the Southdown as a rare breed, they now, I hope, can see the significance that the breed has had and the legacy that it's left behind. And Jonathan, it looks like the breed is going in the right direction.
That's the hope. Yeah, no, it's certainly one of those breeds that's left its legacy across the globe, and it's those early breeders that fixed types, and Bakewell and Elman and all those people, they've really shown the way forward. In terms of breeding and fixing a type and sticking to it and developing a breed into something that's useful.
Well, Jonathan, thanks very much for your time, and you and I will cross paths in other places within the media, but it's great to speak to you again, and we'll see you soon.
Brilliant. Thank you, Andy.
Cheers then. Well, thank you for listening to another episode of Top Lines and Tales. This episode was kindly sponsored by Harbro, manufacturers and suppliers of quality livestock nutrition and livestock nutritional advice. For more information, go to their website or their Facebook page. And whilst on the subject of Facebook, why not visit our Top Lines and Tales Facebook page, where you'll find photographs to back up this and some of our other episodes. We'll see you next time. Cheers.